Welcome to Campus Stories. I'm Victoria Lomax, and joining me today is Mark Houser, a professor of communications and university editor here at Robert Morris University. Mark Houser is a former investigative reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, who in 2005 wrote a story on terrorism in Europe. After the January terrorism attacks in Paris, Mark Houser was sought out for interviews with CNN and Fox News. We are happy to have him with us today. Welcome, Mark Houser. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on the show, Victoria. It's my pleasure.
And about a decade ago, you covered a story on terrorism in France when you came across the name Sharif Kouachi. When hearing about what happened in Paris recently in January, what was it like knowing that, this was one of the guys you sought out?
Well, it was really surreal, was the word that first occurred to me when I heard about it. 10 years ago, when I was a reporter at the Tribune Review, I did a special report on terrorism in Europe, as you said. And the point of it then was there had just been the bombing of the trains in Madrid, and there had, a couple months before then, also had been the murder of this filmmaker in Amsterdam by a Muslim jihadist extremist, a really brutal murder on the streets of Amsterdam. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of talk about the large minority of Muslim immigrants from Northern Africa and from Southern Asia that were living in various countries in Europe, and were they, assimilating or not assimilating, and what were the dangers, how many of them might be dangerous terrorists. So I proposed a story and was funded by an organization in Washington, D.C. called the German Marshall Fund to spend a month in Europe in several different countries talking to experts there about what they were doing to counter terrorism and to integrate their minorities, and also to look at some cases. We know like the 9/11 hijackers came from Hamburg. And so that's when I was in France, I talked to some judges there and an attorney who was representing a guy who had been arrested for being part of a cell that was sending its members from Paris to Iraq to fight American soldiers. And one of those guys was a 20-something-year-old named Sharif Kouachi. And so he was convicted eventually of being a terrorist, engaged in a terrorist enterprise. And he served very little time in prison, though, and they released him. And now, as everybody knows, he's one of the two men that shot up the offices of Charlie Hebdo. So it was very strange and surreal to hear this name again.
You mentioned that Kouachi served very little time. However, he was convicted for 10 years and only served 3. Did the French government give any valid reason, or could you think of any valid reason for releasing a terrorist?
Yeah, that was one of the points of my reporting. So I wanted to show this is a big difference between how the United States and Europe treat cases involving terrorists or suspected terrorists. One of the things that Americans had to discover, most Americans weren't aware of, is that, especially in France and also in Spain to some extent in Germany, those countries had dealt with extremist jihad, Muslim terror groups long before we saw 9/11. I mean, and other kinds of terrorists as well, for that matter. But so the French, in particular, had a very advanced system of surveillance and investigation, and they'd already created a whole separate court system simply for terrorism trials. And they had more rights. Their police had sort of more privileges than ours would. I think one of the things I remember is if you arrested someone and suspected them of terrorism, you could keep them in prison for 3 days without recourse to an attorney. And I think they could be in prison for up to 3 years before a trial. So these are civil rights or human rights that in America they're taken. We assume that you can't imprison someone without benefit of an attorney for 3 days just for questioning. We have laws that prevent that. But the French have a different system. So they were pretty tough in that regard. But on the other hand, in Europe, it's much more the case that sentences, once people are convicted, are short. So in the United States, I think just this past year, we've seen a life sentence for, was it the brother of Osama bin Laden, who basically made videos telling people to go on jihad, but never was implicated in an actual bombing plot or anything, and he just got a life sentence in prison. So we're used to hearing Guantanamo is another example of, that's somewhat a different story, but people in prison for a long time. Whereas in Europe, it seemed to be, they spent a lot of energy finding and tracking and keeping an eye out for these people that they identify, but once they get them convicted, they don't serve a lot of time in jail, and I didn't understand that, frankly, and I was trying to ask a lot of officials about that and make that known in the reporting that I was doing so that people would talk about it.
Thank you, Mark. And coming up after the break, we will have more, so stick around.
Boys are my heroes. They come every week to spend time with my children.
At Robert Morris University, every student is expected to reach out to others.
They can teach them something no one else can.
Wisconsin.
They're role models to the children, and homework comes way before sports. Their grades have improved, and their lives are just a bit richer.
Okay.
What they do for my kids is truly wonderful.
Change someone's life. It changes yours forever. Robert Morris University.
I call them my lifeline.
People don't realize how quickly you can end up on the street. One thing happens in your life, medical bills you can't pay, lose your job, and that's it.
At Robert Morris University, every student is expected to reach out to others.
We went to DC to work with the homeless. They sell a newspaper called Street Sense. Thought I'd help.
But if you want to give more, you can.
This person came up to me and said, "Get a job." And for 2 hours, I felt what it was like to be homeless.
Good morning. $1 help on.
Some of the other students said, "How can we change this?" And I said, "Sometimes you can't change the world, but you may be able to change one person's world." My dream? Open a psych clinic for people on the street.
Change someone's life. It changes yours forever. Robert Morris University.
Welcome back to Campus Stories. If you're just tuning in, joining me is RMU Professor Mark Houser. And before we jump right back into the questions, we have a clip from the interview he did on CNN.
2005, Sharif Kouachi was arrested along with an Islamist recruiter as he prepared to commit violent jihad. Kouachi was then convicted and given a sentence of 10 years in prison, but he only served 3 years before he was released. Kouachi then seemingly fell off the radar for French intelligence, only to be seen again when he and his brother Saeed committed one of the worst terror attacks France has ever experienced. Well, let's talk about this. I'm joined by Mark Houser. He's a university editor at Robert Morris University. He met Sharif Kouachi's lawyer while reporting on counterterrorism in Europe back in 2005. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the show, Carol.
Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. So at the time you wrote, you were surprised that that Kouachi was let out of prison after only 3 years. Why did French authorities decide to do that?
Well, when I visited France and talked to authorities there, in 2005, Kouachi had just been arrested and actually was going to be charged. I talked to France's, one of its 2 top terrorism judges, and Judge Ricard told me at the time that he believed that France certainly did not have very severe criminal sentences for terrorists. So he was aware of this, and so were the French at the time. And I've gone back and looked, and many of the terrorists that I wrote about then are also out. Not just Sharif Kouachi, but also Jamal Bigal, who we've heard about, and also the imam that radicalized Kouachi, or at least that he claimed had radicalized him. He's out too. In fact, he was a nursing student at the hospital where the victims of the Charlie Hebdo shootings were brought.
So you also wrote that Kouachi's lawyer convinced authorities, the judge, that Kouachi had changed his mind about becoming a jihadist. Is that true?
Oh, I don't know that he had convinced them of that. He argued that, certainly. They convicted Kouachi, though. It's simply that, as I said, the sentences in Europe, once the investigators have broken up a ring, and this pattern seems to continue to this day, sadly, but the sentences are not very long, and prisoners are eligible for early release or house arrest. I just read about another Algerian convicted terrorist in France, Saeed Arif, who was in house arrest and stole a car and fled, and they know he's in Syria now. The members of the group, the Hofstad group in the Netherlands, that were linked to the murder of Theo van Gogh, the filmmaker, which I wrote about those people too, and they're released, other than Theo van Gogh's killer. He has a life sentence. And even the head of Al-Qaeda in Spain, a man known as Abu Dada, who was convicted for helping our 9/11 plotters and also suspected of helping the Madrid bombing plotters. He's been released too. I think it was 2013. I'm not sure where he is now.
So why the light sentences? Did they not take these?
We got into talking about the French government and European government and how they give less strict enforcement when it comes to dealing with terrorism. In America, that's clearly not the case. Do you think harsher punishments is the way to go about things when it comes to dealing with terrorists?
Yeah, personally, it seems to me that if you go to the expense and trouble of, putting someone on trial and you find that person guilty of being a terrorist and wanting to blow up a building or kill people or what have you, once you've convicted them, then you should put them in prison for a long time. And if it turns out that they're innocent, they have the ability to appeal. We're not promising that we always get every case right. I mean, some people are wrongly convicted, but it seems to me a lot safer and preferable that if you can at least convict someone in a court of law, that you sentence them appropriately. And it seems to me some of these sentences are like, people spend 4 or 5 years in prison and they're violent, militants. And there are more besides Sharif Kouachi. I mean, his associate, his accomplice in this, the same thing had happened. And I mean, they were known as dangerous people. And there are others that I reported on in my series. And I went back after the CNN, or before the CNN interview, and looked to see what happened to the people that I'd written about who were facing trial 10 years ago. And a disturbing number of them, including the head of Al-Qaeda in Spain, had served their sentences and were back out again. Some of them, there's no reports on where they are now, so who knows? Maybe I'm hoping that the security services know and they're just not putting it in the news, but it's a little scary.
Now, while we may give out harsher punishments or longer sentences to these terrorists, do you think that they could become more radical while in prison?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a danger, and that certainly happens. But I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, you can put people in solitary confinement. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem to make people more rational or easier to rejoin society when their term is up. If you're going to allow them to be in a prison and mingle with the other inmates, then it's likely that some of them will radicalize and get angrier and angrier and make new contacts in prison. So a long sentence till they're old is one way to deal with that. The alternative is, firing squads, and I don't know that we're ready to do that either. So it's not an easy choice.
All right, thank you. And we will have more with Mark Houser coming up after the break.
Nicaragua is a completely different world. We were there to bring nursing care to some desperate people.
At Robert Morris University, every student is expected to reach out to others.
The very first person that I met was David. Kept saying, "You have to come to my house and watch me play my trumpet." You could tell from the look on his face that it was just his most prized possession. I get back home. A few weeks later, I got a message that a gang had broken into his house at night and they stole it, which was his life. So next trip back, we gave him a new one. The look on his face was just complete disbelief. He just absolutely couldn't believe it. And to be able to do something like that is one of the best moments of my life. He said he'd never forget us.
Change someone's life. It changes yours forever. Robert Morris University.
These boys are my heroes. They come every week to spend time with my children.
At Robert Morris University, every student is expected to reach out to others.
They can teach them something no one else can.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. They're role models to the children, and homework comes way before sports. Their grades have improved, and their lives are just a bit richer.
Okay.
What they do for my kids is truly wonderful.
Change someone's life. It changes yours forever. Robert Morris University.
I call them my lifeline.
Welcome back to Campus Stories. Still joining me is Mark Houser. As many of us know, the attack in Paris was triggered by the satirical cartoons of Charlie Hebdo. Do you think Charlie Hebdo went too far?
Well, the attackers definitely targeted Charlie Hebdo, but I think that I would disagree with the idea that Charlie Hebdo triggered the attack. I think that's what the terrorists, that's how they'd want to have us portray it. That said, Charlie Hebdo is a publication that we wouldn't be accustomed to here in the United States, because the French have a tradition of satire, toleration for satire, that I think exceeds ours in the United States. So if you've seen some of the covers, and in the news were a lot of the covers that showed Muhammad, and it's a cartoon drawing of a guy in a turban, or to those of us who aren't Muslim, it doesn't seem that objectionable, but to those of us who are Christian, to see some of the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo has had on its cover, sort of mocking Christianity, some of them, racy is not a sufficient word to describe them. I mean, it's really obscene in some cases, cartoons. Anyway, this is on the newsstand every week. So in France, that's what people are accustomed to, and they prize this idea that there's a freedom of the press to mock anyone in power, and I don't think it's right to blame Charlie Hebdo for the attack. I think that's what the terrorists did, but that's not what we should do.
With the right to free speech, do you feel as though we should have a responsibility with our freedom of speech? Meaning, just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, there's what's good manners, and then there's what should the law be. I think the Pope was saying something along these same lines. A lot of people have said this, that, to just deliberately offend people, which is precisely what Charlie Hebdo is for, to deliberately offend people, to show that no one's protected. There's no one in society that is allowed to say, you can't offend us. That's their whole reason for being. So, a lot of us would be uncomfortable going to work every day, deliberately trying to offend and hurt people's feelings. So is that a job I'd want to do? No, definitely not. But is it an important principle that freedom of the press extends to speech, or to writing, to drawings, that people find, distinctly offensive? Well, yeah, there's a libel law, right, for untrue, character assassination of people, but just putting out ideas that annoy or irritate or offend religious faithful or followers of a political party or what have you, that's an important principle, that they have the freedom to do that.
You mentioned that Charlie Hebdo deliberately offends. If they deliberately offend, say, everyone, would that make it right?
There's been a lot of commentary about Charlie Hebdo and how it offends in the religious sense. Does it offend Jews? Does it offend Christians? Does it offend Muslims all at the same level? Does it go as far in offending Jews? I think there was and this is what some of the Muslim immigrants have said, is, look, when they say something that's anti-Semitic, people get all angry at them. But they say stuff that's anti-Muslim, and everyone says, oh, that's freedom of the press. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in and I haven't watched every single cover of Charlie Hebdo, so I can't say with certainty whether the claim has merit, but certainly something to think about is sometimes people can perceive that the media is fairer towards one group than another, or more more respecting of, a group's dignity, let's say. And Europe has obviously a history with this, so there's some context that we have to think about too.
Now, if we were to ever draw the line from our freedom of speech, would that diminish what we say?
Yeah, I think so. I think what was it, Ben Franklin's quote, that people that give up liberty for security deserve neither. So, I mean, that's a powerful comment. I think that it's true that if you make exceptions to what we are assuming we're free to say and the expressions we're free to make, for each of those concessions that you give, for the sake of not upsetting people, for the sake of not causing a ruckus, each of those concessions is an abridgment of your freedom. And so you shouldn't want to give away any of your freedom without a very, very good reason.
Thank you, Mark. And coming up after the break, we will have one more brief segment, so stick around.
G-Morning, sunshine. Wakey, wakey. Text me. Are your parents home later? We can hang. LUV, love you. JK. Holla back. Holla back. Holla back. Are you with your friends? That's lame. We're in a huge fight right now. XO. What'd you dream about? Something I did. Are you on your way to the mall? I'm lonely. Nude pics. Send me some. Text me.
I'm starving. What's for breakfast?
Guten Tag!
Johannes, Franz!
I bring you arts-enriched Raisinblums, fortified with increased test scores and creative problem-solving skills.
It's good!
And good for you.
Bobby? Susie?
Don't worry, that's just the power of the art.
Feed your kids the arts. For 10 simple ways to learn how, visit americansforthearts.org.
You ever think about buying a bigger place?
Just waiting for a visit from the credit fairy.
There is no credit fairy.
How else will I get a better credit score?
Look, you keep your credit card balances low and only open a new card if you really need it.
No fairy?
There's no magic to improving your credit, but there's help, and it's free. Go to creditfairy.org.
Yes, ready.
Oh, come on, Randy. Animal shelter, here I come. And no, I'm not crazy or emotionally damaged. That's a stereotype. I just belong to a total loser. I'm a good dog. So if you want a pet, adopt. And if you see Randy, tell him he dropped his wallet.
Welcome back to the show. Before we sign off, we have just a little bit more time with Mark Houser. So Mark, what initially made you want to become an investigative journalist?
I think I was very interested and curious in the world around me. I liked learning new things and putting myself in new experiences, trying to find out what was worth reporting, what was the truth as far as I could tell, and especially the idea of being in different situations. So getting to go to Europe and write about terrorists and meet people who were lawyers for terrorists or judges prosecuting terrorists, or Muslim immigrants who were at a mosque and were talking about what it was like to move there. But I did lots of stories besides terrorism. I mean, that was one. I was 15 years at the Tribune Review, and the part about terrorism was, a couple of months. So I wrote about the justice system. I wrote about technology and robots, and I wrote about immigrants to Pittsburgh area and all sorts of things, and just interesting people. And I loved the chance to tell stories, and I loved the fact that, each day was a new chance to start over and find a new story and dig into it and find the part that was entertaining or interesting.
You primarily wrote about terrorists back in 2005 and never really looked at it again.
That's
Would
right.
you go back to writing about terrorism?
Well, I think it would be worth going back and revisiting, like I said, the sort of seeing how things have changed in the last 10 years. I mean, I find it troubling and fascinating and interesting why it is that after, the attacks in London, the attacks in Madrid and so forth, 9/11 and many other things, that so many of these people that at the time I was writing about were facing trial, and some of them were facing long prison sentences supposedly, are now out of prison. And I guess the question arises in my mind is, didn't they learn anything? Are they playing chicken? Are they courting disaster? These societies, they have people that they just, I think things might change too. So now that the whole thing sadly has happened in Paris, that maybe some of the authorities there are thinking, maybe we'll be a little tougher with sentences now. Who knows?
With your career as an investigative journalism, what has been your favorite part?
Telling the stories, as I said, but another thing that I loved is the sort of people that work in a newsroom. That was a great environment because you're surrounded by other people that are motivated by the same thing. Not necessarily money. We talked about motivation in class yesterday, but certainly motivated by just a fascination with the world and a real deep desire to get out there and find stories and find, trends or find injustices, problems that they want to talk about, that they want to dig into and find what's behind them. And it's just always great conversations and sort of a dark sense of humor too. So that was a tremendous time. I fondly remember those days.
Would you have any advice for students who want to get in the same career path as you?
Yeah. It's tricky because journalism, while there's always going to be a journalism and a desire for writing about current events, the form that it takes to get to people is changing pretty drastically. And one of the reasons that I'm not a journalist anymore is I was a little worried about where things are going for newspapers and so forth. But yeah, I think that it's a great idea to focus on not just the talent of, and the ability to write well and to present your information in a way that is entertaining and attractive or thought-provoking, but also just learning about the world around you. So you could study other things to be an expert about, whether that's business or what have. It could be business or entertainment, or you choose. Other countries, terrorists, robots, whatever it is that you want to know about. It's good to be an expert in at least one field.
Now, strangely, you keep mentioning robots. Do you have a fad with robots?
When I was at the Trib, one of my beats was high-tech research and robotics. So I spent a lot of time at Carnegie Mellon learning about artificial intelligence and watching robots play soccer. And so, yeah, that was fun. I liked writing robot stories. There was a lot of interesting developments going on in Pittsburgh. And so.
Well, thank you, Mark. On that note, we're going to sign off today. So thank you for watching Campus Stories. And until next time, I'm Victoria Lomax.